Dolores and I attended Thursday's Christmas Eve service, which I found religiously inspirational as a matter of memory rather than current belief. I will, however, freely admit that Silent Night, wonderfully sung as a congregation with candles glowing in the darkened sanctuary, brought tears to my eyes. It is a sign, I believe, of long-awaited maturity that my response to tearing up was not a synaptic jolt of anger at having been manipulated by place and circumstance, but rather a patient understanding that, like it or not, my Catholic past does maintain residence in my psyche, despite my shoulder to the closet door. And, well, the singing really was beautiful. Nevertheless, it would be hypocritical not to acknowledge that the entire service, while indeed lovely, had for me absolutely nothing to do with an oft-described but not so well-documented birth a fairly long time ago. Which brings me to my theme today. What does it mean for a formerly lapsed Catholic of some 50 years to have attended a service which was dripping with Christianity as a fully committed Unitarian Universalist? I considered that last Thursday's remarkable service was really communal theater, a kind of secular pageant with a wink and a nod at a liturgy not many of us take altogether seriously, the virgin birth being a bit of a stretch. But frankly, that strikes me as a kind of former English professor pretension. It was neither pageant nor theater, but rather spiritual in a way that I continue to struggle to understand. To put it another way, my spirit was willing, but not enough to genuflect. I have been preoccupied lately with the image of the liturgical collar. My research tells me that by the mid-19th century, Anglican clergy felt a need to separate themselves from the secular world, and that would be the likes of you and me, with the adoption of a distinctive clerical dress. And by the 1880s, the clerical collar had become common across denominations. I should say here that I have tremendous respect for the women and men who enter a ministry in a spirit of personal belief and the desire to help others discover their travel along their spiritual paths. I have witnessed Joan Javier Duval and Daniel Gregoire enter the ministry as fully committed Unitarian Universalists, humbled by the work before them, and eager to lead by example rather than dictum. I am constantly inspired by the work of spiritual leaders such as the late Mother Teresa, our own Sister Mary Scullion, and Karen Armstrong, each of whom rises well above the ease and ultimate tyranny of received creed. I will say also that I loathe the trappings of collar and cassock that grant the symbol of privilege and authority to a few, overwhelmingly male, who hold on to that privilege and authority by restricting independent spiritual thinking. For a strikingly repugnant image, think only of a sanctuary of fully costumed men at the Mass conducted by Pope Francis during his recent visit. If there was a woman anywhere in the Basilica, she was well off to the side. But it is only 2 days after Christmas, a Christmas celebration that was joyous and shared with many of you, so I will save my contempt for hierarchical religion for another day. Instead of going on about how I reject religion out of a can, I will admit that in the absence of ingredients printed on the side of the label, I find myself on my own, and sometimes frighteningly so. So let's start with this. Our minister does not wear a collar, though I will grant him the stole, as it is full of the colors of joy and individualism, as is Unitarian Universalism itself. And in the spirit of our faith, Kent Mathias speaks to me as a minister who shares my sense that life is not a matter of existential accident. Yet happily, he does not presume to tell me what the alternative to existential accident might be. The very beginning of my life was certainly a matter of an apparently rather manic sperm cell getting there first. But I believe the evolving of my life, of everyone's life, does have meaning beyond the random blundering of day to day until our time runs out. I don't think that life is simply a matter of cells and synaptic development. Yet neither do I think of it as utterly directed. I am reasonably sure that when I die, there will be neither pearly gates nor the grand scorekeeper computing the math. On the other hand, reason has failed me before, and if it should in this account, I will hope that the scorekeeper is of an all-forgiving universalist nature. In any case, if life is more than the sum of our biological selves, what is it, and more importantly, where do we find it? For we are members of a faith that may be the most demanding of all in its requirements that we find spiritual fulfillment within the context of a faith that we create. Prescriptive religion, of course, provides the answer for many. And yet religion, as we have seen through the centuries, can be profoundly troubling. In my own search to understand the meaning of my life in the palace of the universe, I've closed the door on hierarchical religion as simply a tool that constricts the search to understand faith, that shrinks the palace to a small house on a narrow street overseen by landlords eager to direct the landscaping. And yet, while we are not hierarchical, we are undoubtedly a church. And here I am in this place talking to you on a Sunday morning rather than simply meditating over Eggs Benedict and a Bloody Mary. I made reference a moment ago to being frighteningly on my own with respect to exploring my faith. While that may be true in some undefined and quite possibly over-dramatic way, it would appear not to be true in any meaningful way, as being here with you is testament to connection. We are here together precisely to declare that we are not on our own, even as each of us has a path that is different. There is a beautiful paradox in being a UU. On the one hand, there is the power of the seven principles which function as a stand-in for a creed and the responsibility of trying to practice them. On the other hand, how do I look for the spiritual in the context of what appeared to be secular prescriptions? One of the benefits of having the opportunity to speak from the pulpit from time to time is the necessary reflection of trying to figure out what to say. And in doing so, for this meditation, I believe I may have found a resolution to the paradox, which can be summed up as Ott's folly, which constitutes a serious misreading of the seven principles and perhaps even Unitarian Universalism itself. In understanding my error, I recognize that I have simply read the words. I have processed them in exactly the same way I would process any set of principles with which I agree. In short, I have framed the seven principles as an intellectual construct directing secular behavior rather than seminal precepts for conducting one's life in the context of faith. Words, of course, are symbols that describe categories of meaning, and it would appear that I have not exercised enough care in understanding the spiritual meaning inherent in the seven principles. In his brilliant 2005 sermon, A Saving Faith, Forrest Church remarked that theology is poetry, not science. So there I was, reading the sermon online, and just about fell out of my chair when I came to that sentence. Actually, the focus of Church's sermon is a rousing defense of Unitarian Universalism as a fully formed religion that should be celebrated for what it is, rather than most often happens, for what it isn't. And I recommend that you read it if you haven't. I remain troubled by the idea of religion, though I'm planning on rereading Church's sermon a few more times to see if he can change my mind, and I'm beginning to think that perhaps he might. Nevertheless, there was that sentence, theology is poetry. Isn't that remarkable? Setting aside the idea of a God wandering around somewhere in the meaning of theology, to think of spiritual belief as poetry makes perfect sense. The idea of understanding faith as a poem, nonlinear and at its best ineffable, was something of an epiphany. Like a poem, faith depends on images and connotation rather than the commands and prescriptions of prose. It is about what we feel rather than what we think, at least when we come at it from our best selves. Good prose speaks plainly and adheres to strict rules of grammar, syntax, and logical arrangement. Poetry sings and teases, showing just enough theme to assure us that it has direction, but insisting that it's really more about what's to come than a place of arrival. Prose is a set of directions to a particular destination. Poetry, if we are open to it, is about what happens along the way. In his wonderful poem, Ars Poetica, read earlier in the service, Archibald MacLeish ends by claiming that a poem should not mean but be. Perhaps that is also true of faith. Perhaps, like a poem, faith should be understood as a mist that rises up from the river in the early morning hours. In that mist that envelops not just place, but imagination, I have felt myself connected to the magic of being and found myself understanding that faith is a place where the rules of time and space are suspended, and what's left is simply that which is in the mist. We see this in the 7 principles. The 7th, for instance, is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. How is it possible to experience that without the poetic imagination that allows us to see existence as a web that goes on, interconnected strand by interconnected strand, rather than squaring off as walls of prescribed belief? Poetry is all about myth, and myth is all about exploring the miraculous. It is glorious and illuminated. Myth takes on dark organ chords only when it's promulgated as truth. In and of itself, the virgin birth is a wonderful story of celebration, as is the birth of a Messiah in a lowly stable, equally wonderful as a juxtaposition of the majestic and the humble. But it stops being a myth when it becomes creed. When, to paraphrase MacLeish, it posits itself as true rather than equal to. And when it does that, it extinguishes the imagination. I have noted in a previous meditation that by training I am a product of the Enlightenment. And I'm grateful that I have the opportunity here with you to continue my struggle to resolve that part of me which believes in the dominance of the rational and the part which is compelled to acknowledge the presence of magic. Being here allows me to see the trap of thinking that magic is some sort of trick that cheapens the search for objective truth. Rather, magic is the wonder of all things connected. Through the magic of the Spirit, I know I am decidedly not alone. I know that I come here instead of staying home with my Eggs Benedict and Bloody Mary, because here is where I can find wonder. Faith, by definition, is magical. It is absent the structure of logic. Even so, because we are human, we try to find meaning using the tools of prose: the who, what, when, where, and of course, the always present why. But we also have the gift of imagination. Inside the poem, there are rhythms and charms that soar above grammar, syntax, and linear meaning. We read poems because of our faith in the imagination. So too can we explore faith as an aspect of that same imagination. We can write our own stories, create our own myths. I believe that when my brain dies, so too will my consciousness. In the meantime, I have the 7 principles as guides to exercise my Unitarian Universalist faith. Taken together, they can be heard as a chant, and all chants are poetry. Taken together, we can hear in them a belief in the possibility of individual and collective human greatness. Taken together, the 7 principles are not simply grammar, syntax, and direction. They are intimations of faith. As far as church would have it, the 7 principles are not the authoritarian province of those who wear a liturgical collar. They belong to you and me as our Unitarian Universalist creed. It is not true that UUs lack core beliefs. What is true is that we are free to interpret our hard-won beliefs in ways that satisfy individual spiritual journey. Prose is explaining what we know. Poetry is about searching. The 7 principles are our faith. They are a poem in the season and spirit of the season, very searching.